And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024. Good evening. Welcome to the program. I'm Stephen Grootes. Well, it's that kind of week in the middle of the year where you'll find that government schools and private schools are on holiday at the same time. And you would think that that might mean that actually there'll be a little bit less company news. After all, people who work in companies and lead companies often have children, not always, but often. And yet there's still quite a few big issues sort of bubbling around at the moment. Inflation targeting is one of them, and whether we'll get a new lower CPI, a new lower inflation target, I should say, does seem to be the case. Quite a strong comment by Cheslyn Jacobs on Bloomberg TV last night, although he's not the first person to say it in recent times. We'll talk about that in just a moment. I've been struck by, once again, more and more talk about online gambling. News 24 had what I thought was an important report this morning, showing how easy it was for children under the age of 18 to be gambling online. Some, it seemed, had said that they had won huge amounts. Now, one of the things about gambling is that if you're under 18 and you actually win the money, they're not obligated to pay it because you're under 18. So I was curious as to how this all actually worked out. But there was also, and I think this was a couple of months ago now, Perpetua, the fund, they put out a report talking about how much money is going into online gambling. Here's the thing. At some point, it seems to me, and I've made the point that I think something very bad will happen as a result of all of this. But when it comes to gambling, the house always wins. And in this case, the people who are gambling are the ones who will lose. And unfortunately, due in some ways to the nature of our society, the people who are gambling are the people who are the most desperate. I do think there's going to be a big issue here at some point, something we really seriously need to discuss. I realize that the provinces make money out of it through the licensing, but I can't help but feel that national government actually, sooner rather than later, needs to look at it as in a much more holistic way. I mean, the genie may be out of the bottle, may just not be able to put it back. But I do think we need to be very, very careful with the regulation about this. There are so many different ways to lose money now, and we'll be talking about that. I asked yesterday, at what age do you want to stop working? Do you have an idea? Will you know when you get there? We will talk about forming a retirement policy for a company with Andrew Woodburn in about half an hour from now. Looking forward to that conversation. I still don't know if you have a very strong view on this. I think a lot of people, maybe you just keep working until you just don't want to anymore. And actually, that can happen quite suddenly. You can sort of, decide 2 months from now, actually, I'm going to retire and that's it. Unless there is a mandatory retirement policy. I'm not always convinced a mandatory retirement policy is such a good idea. Some people continue to add value. I mean, Pick and Pay clearly believe, with good reason, that Sean Summers is adding value, and he came back at the age of 72. Standard Bank say no, once you hit 63, you can't stay as an executive. Used to be 58. So, I mean, it's interesting just to see how it all pans out. Used to be 60, excuse me. But it's just interesting to see the kind of conversations people have. And legally, as I understand it, the retirement age you've actually agreed to in your employment contract. Do you really look at the retirement age in your employment contract when you excited about signing up, getting going, sorting out the medical aid, all of those things? Yeah, me neither. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, the rand a bit stronger today, and I suppose partially as a result of those comments made on Bloomberg last night by the Reserve Bank Governor Cheslyn Jacobs. He said a new inflation target will be adopted by South Africa very soon. Presumably, that target will be 3% rather than the current band of between 3 and 6%. But the outgoing Capitec CEO, Gerrie Fourie, and we're due to speak to him soon, I think tomorrow, has sort of waded back into this argument. He said today, he's been talking, of course, about how to grow the economy and employment, but he also said policymakers should be focused on the real interest rate. In other words, the real interest that you pay on a loan rather than the official interest rate from the Reserve Bank. Azai Mhlanga is the chief economist at Rand Merchant Bank. Azai, good evening. What's the difference between the interest rate charged by banks and the real interest rate that you and I actually experience?
So the one that we pay for our normal mortgages or car repayments or credit cards, that's the nominal interest rates, which means it's not adjusted for inflation. But what investors will have to look at is the real one, which means you adjust for inflation. It's really one and the same concept depending on how simple you want to communicate. If you're talking to the man on the street, they understand a lot more what they pay, which is the normal interest rate. But if you're talking to an investor, such as the Captech CEO, for instance, a business person, a business executive, what would make a lot more sense is the real interest rate. But policymakers, they take into account, actually, they look at the real interest rate. If you look at all modeling exercises, when you're trying to model the economy, to forecast growth, you have a real interest rate embedded in there, which is what policymakers will take into account. So it's not really that policymakers are not accounting for real rates. They actually look at that. That's what actually drives the economy.
So is Gerrie Fourie not really saying anything here? I mean, is that how you would see it?
No, it's neither here nor there, really. Policymakers look at real rates. It's just the audience that they will be communicating with, what makes sense so that that audience understands easier. If they are communicating to the general public, to labor that needs to set wage settlements agreement, they will talk about the nominal interest rate. That's easy for that constituents to understand. But if they are talking to investors, for example, asset managers, whether local or offshore, they can talk about the real interest rate because that's what matters for bond markets, for instance. So it's really just the audience which they will be talking to and what is easier to communicate so that that audience quickly understand what they're talking about.
Governor Kganyago saying last night that we'll sort of adopt this new inflation target very soon. And the Deputy Finance Minister, David Masondo, said something similar. I think it was about 2 months ago now. We keep being told soon, not quite imminently, but I imagine that's the next word. Do you believe it's going to happen? It does seem momentum is building in that direction.
Look, the momentum is building. The economic rationale is quite clear. If you look at our major trading partners, they all target on average about 3%. Out of a sample of about 38 countries, you only have 3 countries that target a higher inflation, whether a point or a band, than South Africa. Some of those economies is Ghana and Guyana, economies that we shouldn't really compare ourselves with. Most of our PA economies are targeting on average 3%, which means if we continue to target a high inflation, we then lose competitiveness relative to those economies. So that's one of the economic argument. The other one is we have about 40% of our stock of bonds that are inflation linked, which means if you continue to have structurally high inflation, the debt servicing costs for those will also be higher. And for other nominal bonds, that is the other 60%, you are issuing them at a higher debt servicing cost simply because higher inflation begets higher interest rates and higher debt servicing costs. So if you reduce inflation over time, interest rates will be lower, the cost of capital will be lower, the cost of debt for the whole economy will be lower. So that's the economic argument, which is quite clear. The debate is really about the sacrifice ratio. Over a short term, it will require higher real rates to push inflation expectations lower. And those higher real rates have a negative impact on growth. It's debatable how big that impact is. The SAB and other economists or researchers estimate between 0.3 and 0.5% of GDP as the cost. But the long-term benefits of lower debt servicing costs outweigh the short-term benefits. So again, you have more support. But politically, do you want to invest political capital to deal with the inflation target, or you want to do that for implementing economic reforms, budget processes? Perhaps the answer is you can do both.
I mean, so all of that, I understand. One of the questions I've heard put about this is that the Reserve Bank has been able to hit its inflation target very consistently for most of the time because it's quite easy. Well, it's relatively easy to hit an inflation target of between 3 and 6%. Their job will be much harder if their job is to hit exactly 3% all the time.
It boils down to their credibility. If the assessment is that they're highly credible, and they will signal to the market, as they already did in the May MPC, that they would prefer inflation at 3% rather than the current 4.5 midpoint. And if economic agents and role players in the economy believe the SARB will be able to do whatever it needs to do in order to push inflation expectations to 3%. They will start adjusting their wage settlements. So, for instance, when you negotiate your salary with your employer, because that employer believes the SARB will hit a 3% target, they won't give you a 7% increase in your salaries. They will anchor closer to where they expect the monetary policy makers to hit the inflation target. So that then begins the adjustments of inflation expectations closer to the target. But if the assessment is that the central bank is not credible, then they will find it difficult to hit their inflation target quicker. But as we have seen, the SARB is quite credible. We have learned from 2017 when they moved to targeting a 4.5% that they are quite credible and they can do what they need to do to hit the target which they aim for.
Zion Plunger, thank you so much, Chief Economist at Rand Merchant Bank.
The Money Show.
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
And DSTV channel 856.
Well, more developments today, it seems, in the dispute between TymeBank and the Home Affairs Department over the fees Home Affairs is now going to charge banks and other institutions to access the National Population Register. TymeBank says the new fees will make it much harder to bank poorer people. Capitec is backing Home Affairs. The Home Affairs Minister, Leon Schreiber, told us last week how angry he was at TymeBank. He says they're making a fortune while complaining about a relatively small increase. Cheslyn Jacobs is the Chief Commercial Officer at TymeBank. Cheslyn, good evening to you. You've now given the example of banking someone who receives an SRD grant, so 370 Rand a month. How much would it cost you to set up an account for that person? How important would the new verification fee be in that cost?
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to listeners, and thanks for having us again. So, as the article we put out today states that based on, call it the old infrastructure, it must probably cost us in the region of about 50 Rand to acquire this customer, and obviously there's some ongoing costs in servicing this customer. With the proposed change, which actually went live today, it increases that cost by an additional 20 Rand, so the 50 Rand becomes 70 Rand. And then, in essence, makes it largely unsustainable to successfully bank at a minimum 7.5 million SRD grant recipients. But I think it's important to note that almost 15 million South Africans actually apply for this assistance every single month. Why is the cost currently 50 Rand to open the bank account for you? Isn't it mostly just IT stuff? No, so an important part that I think it's important to remember is that, in essence, when you allow a customer to fully interact in the national payment system, what in essence you want them to have is a linked debit card or a linked check card. And to issue that piece of plastic was probably the largest portion of that 50 Rand today. But again, with the increase proposed by the department, it fundamentally changes the unit economics of serving these customers. What Home Affairs is doing is they're going to have two separate rates. There's peak and there's off-peak. Wouldn't you be able to, and the off-peak rate is much cheaper, it's a Rand essentially, wouldn't you be able to use that time to deal with clients who receive SRD grants, the clients you say you're talking about? Yeah, it's also important to consider the element of convenience specifically for these customers, Stephen. I think with KYC, so FICA, traditional bank legislation, it obligates banks to first fully verify customers' identity before they can actively participate. And if you can't do that in real time, in essence, what you ask these customers to make multiple visits to banking infrastructure to get this done. And that in itself becomes a liability for that customer. And then the question has to be whether it's worth their while actively engaging in the banking system in the country or not. And I think we have to put a price on that level of convenience, specifically for these customers. Okay, so I hear you, but I think Schreiber was furious last week. I don't know if you heard his conversation with us. I know he's spoken elsewhere. He's spoken on social media about this as well. But as I understand the state of play, he says you were consulted, and your bank is saying you can find no record of that consultation, no email or anything like that. I find it quite difficult to understand how your institution could somehow have been left out when all the others clearly were consulted. And from what I can see, you're really the only one that is raising this issue in this way. So there has been other industry bodies, specifically in the telecommunications space, that's raised it. There has been the microfinance institution has raised it. And we have the view that more people will raise it as it starts really impacting their businesses. But I think, again, to put on record, Stephen, and in all our previous communication, we did state that we did raise our concerns via SABRIC, and that was the channel that was offered to us. But off the back of the decision, it's clear that the concerns we raised seems to have not been considered when making this decision. And again, I think we've continuously put on the record is that we've never been anti the price increase. What we question is the quantum, the timing, and we think there are better ways to do it. And I think the initial open letter alluded to that. And I think we've been very consistent in what we've communicated. Additionally, subsequent to all of this is that we've been unable to sit across the table with the minister, and it's still something we'd absolutely love to do, to find what we believe the best way forward would be. And it's, again, not about the bank, specifically TymeBank, but again, it's about the people we think these kind of decisions ultimately will impact.
Okay. The other point Home Affairs makes is that institutions have been running their entire client databases through the system virtually every day. There's been huge abuse. People have been doing it too often. I understand there can occasionally be reasons to do that. But is there any option that you have, apart from raising the price, that would stop that kind of, well, it does look like abuse to me.
Yeah, and I think that's where these kind of conversations become important, because we are of the view there are lots of ways to do it, and I think we would support the logic to say that if you're doing it just for the sake of doing it, where there's no, call it, legislative obligation to verify identity, I think we could agree that that's abuse, and by no means is that ever what we've done, and I think largely in the industry, I don't think that has been happening. And that's why I think a really constructive conversation between people like ourselves and the minister would be very welcome.
Cheslyn Jacobs, thanks very much indeed. Chief Commercial Officer at TymeBank.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Anthony Modasani is the Senior Equity Sales Trader at ABSA CIB. Anthony, good evening. Good to see you again. Lots of talk around ABSA. Kenny Fichler gave an interview. The new CEO, he gave an interview to Bloomberg. I quite liked one of his descriptions that he wants to stop ABSA branches from looking like prison cells because they're guarding cash. I thought that was interesting. I mean, there's a lot going on around ABSA at the moment, obviously.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks. Always good to be here, Stephen. So Kenny gave a little bit of a chat about restructuring and, it's a little bit of a turnaround plan. I think it's easy to sort of kitchen sink when you arrive and, lower investors' expectations. He's gone more bold and he wants ABSA to be the biggest in the retail banking space. He's also talking about improving the net non-interest revenue and also improving the return on equity. So he's talking a really exciting story. He's going to be speaking to the CEO, to the board in a couple and presenting his, his plans there. It does sound really exciting. It's, whether he can get it over the line and get it done.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to watch. I mean, there's a lot to look at there. Lesetja Kganyago and the inflation target. I mean, to my sort of political, financial mind, such as it is, it does look like clearly momentum is building. People keep saying it's going to happen, but you can't keep saying it's going to happen soon and it doesn't happen. I mean, this is still about credibility in so many ways.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's quite interesting. It has been something we've heard for the last 12 to 18 months, right? They've socialized it, and I think that's part of getting the market's mind around it and understanding that this is where they want to go to. Sort of if you tell people we want to go to 3% now, we're at 3%, inflation 2.8 at the moment. He did make mention about the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana. They need their support. So I think it's going to get presented to him and Enoch Godongwana, and hopefully we get something before midterm budget. I think that's sort of the target everyone has in their mind for when we get an official announcement, probably.
So it'll come during that speech or before?
I think before the speech. They'll probably want to land that before the speech.
Very interesting. The tariff deadline. So this is with the US now, Parkstown, the DTIC, a lot going on around the DTIC, saying that they're asking the US for a bit of an extension. And if I remember the history of all of this correctly, there was the Trump Liberation Day, then 90 days to basically work out tariffs and some sort of agreement. That runs out next week. And I imagine there's a little bit of a queue of countries, including us, who are asking for an extension.
Absolutely. We've asked for an extension due to something around the framework. They need to adjust the way they table the framework. I think, the EU sort of taken the stance that they're actually happy to take the blanket tariff, 10% tariff around most things, for the exception of like aluminium, steel, and so on and so forth. But there's always that phrase about the taco trade, or they label Trump with taco, right? Trump always chickens out, and I think he's sort of taken that side and say he's not going to chicken out, and he will implement. So there are a couple of countries that are sort of in the queue, sort of trying to negotiate for more times. I know Japan's having a bit of trouble, where he said he's happy to implement tariffs, and he's playing a bit of hardball there. So from one to the next, it's getting quite tricky. It'll be interesting to see what happens next week.
Interesting to look at stocks today, and the Foschini Group, Pepkor, and Clicks were all up quite significantly. Is that still around inflation? Are people expecting something to happen?
I think just on the back of, we had a lot of rand strength feed in post Lesego Kganyago's comments, and that's sort of a sector where, you read into consumer sentiment. Look, given that we're getting a bit of a petrol hike next week, that's not ideal for it. But I think, investors are just seeing value there. There's nothing new specific out there. We've just come through month end and half year end now. So, maybe just stocks that look cheap relative to the rest of the sector at the moment.
Anthony Modasani, thanks so much for coming in. Really do appreciate it. Senior equity sales trader at Absa CIB. Well, let's just see how all of that pans out. Lots going on with the US. I've made the point before. Can the US really conduct negotiations with all of these countries all at the same time, or within a kind of 90-day period? That doesn't really seem to be the aim. The aim seems, I suppose, in some ways to be something else, just perhaps. We'll talk retirement ages in the next half hour. It's just gone 6:30.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes.
Well, good to hear from you this evening. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. News today that Hyprop, the property company, are going to sell 50% of their stake in Hyde Park. Hyde Park, of course, one of the sort of maybe slightly smaller shopping centres in Joburg, but kind of always posh. That's how I always saw it, certainly growing up. Hyde Park was sort of one of the posher places. Look at some of the clientele, look at who's there, look at the sort of size of the bookshops, however you want to judge these things. Look at maybe just the average expense. Has a very high trading density, I understand, which would kind of feed into all of those things. But just sort of a couple of things about Hyde Park. Pick n Pay, for years, the main anchor tenant, and I say anchor partly because it was sort of in the basement, right at the bottom. Now they're gone. Checkers is, of course, taking over. But it did make me think about what goes into running a shopping centre. A huge amount. I mean, I read this week, I didn't know this before, that Eastgate actually has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, privately owned sort of non-utility scale solar power generation plants. Eastgate, as you know, is right on the border between Joburg and Ekurhuleni. It's where Eastgate is. It's, it's Bruma. And just looking at what it takes to actually run a shopping centre successfully. So on one level, it should be the easiest thing in the world. We all love to shop. We all need to shop. You get your anchor tenants in, you get a good mix, and off you go. The example of Four Ways More, of course, shows you that absolutely is not the case. It is still possible to have what look like the right elements, be in the right place. I mean, the market around Four Ways is absolutely massive, and yet still actually battle, and that mall has battled. You know me, though, and I always come back to the same thing, parking. If you don't get parking right, easy, simple, preferably free, if you don't have lots of it, or at least one option for free parking, maybe Sandton City gets away without that. They used to have free parking or quite cheap parking at one point. Maybe parts of them still do. I just have missed them. The point I'm getting to, though, is you've got to make parking easy. And if you do that, I found in my experience, I'll actually go further to go to a shopping centre where I find the parking easier than actually go to the one closest to me. And yes, I know you can use the Admit app and all the rest. I'm fine with all of that. But just make it easy. But just interesting to see how some shopping centres absolutely flourish for a very long time, and some still seem to battle despite having all of the elements that they should have. Your views, very interested to hear them.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Well, a report in Business Live today that government is looking at creating a national business licensing policy. as I understand it, that would mean there'll be one business license system that everyone would have to follow. So no matter which province or municipality registered your business in, you would follow pretty much the same process. Tebogo Kaas at the Institute of Chartered Entrepreneurs. Tebogo, good evening. I mean, I've lost count of the number of times government has said it wants to cut red tape for business. Would this proposal, if it happens, make much of a difference?
You are not alone, Stephen. I've also lost count on how many times government talk about easing the regulatory burden for small businesses and entrepreneurs. And sadly, personally, I haven't heard from government since last year when they issued that draft policy for comment. I'm not aware where the story of the business life today is predicated on. But be that as it may, the issue of business licensing and regulation is something that is always has been with us, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
I mean, if you look at, and I mean, there's been this big argument lately about formal versus informal businesses. But if you look, for example, at how the police or the city of Joburg or Ekurhuleni or Tekwini, for that matter, or Cape Town, I suppose, in some ways, maybe treat informal businesses. You can't sort of sell things here, you can't sell things there, things like that. I mean, you just don't get a sense of an enabling environment at all, or even a deliberate attempt to create an enabling environment.
No, absolutely. And one other enabling component of enabling environment is actually enforcement. Because what is the point of having a regulation or laws which cannot be enforced? If I take, for example, Alexandra, in the township or geographical area of Alexandra, policing area of Alexandra, we've got 204 taverns. And majority of it, apparently, as per the reports, the majority of those are not licensed. And every time the local police go and shut them down, as soon as the police have gone, those very same outlets are operating again. And some of them you find that they're actually operating next to schools or next to churches. Well, never mind churches, but next to school or being ease of access. And some of those, actually, including, for example, taxis that are operated, scholar transport, which are not properly regulated. Some of them are operated by people who should be on the national register for sex offenders.
I mean, do you think government has just lost the will to kind of cut red tape? I mean, surely it shouldn't be that hard. Lots of countries have done this. I know the Western Cape has had a red tape reduction unit. I don't know. I can't say what impact that's had. But there was one located, I think, in the presidency at 6 years old now. And I don't know if it's got lost somewhere.
Well, as it turns out, that red tape within the presidency was only concerned about red tape for big business, making sure that their visas and other things can be processed smoothly, but not so much about red tape as it pertains to small businesses who often have to go through a lot of hoops to actually even get a legitimate business to a license to operate, especially in those regulated industries or areas such as the ones that you've referred to, whether it's in the retail or even in the transportation sector. And yet government keeps on saying regulatory burdens for small business will be late. Maybe that's something that should be part of the national dialogue. I'm not sure. We've been talking, and really it's all about implementation. It's all about making sure that the rules get to be followed. Then we can talk about a new policy. Enforce the laws that is currently there, which is not the case.
So I would like to believe that what's been reported today is going to happen, and government might adopt a sort of national business licensing plan. Okay. But we could still find very different enforcement. So let me give you a different example. If I go for a driver's license card, if I need a new one, and unfortunately I will this year, I imagine I'll get a very different service in different parts of the country or different parts of the city even. And won't businesses have the same thing? Yes, there might be one set of very clear criteria. Everyone is supposed to do it in this way. But you might still find that licensing officials, council officials, and even the police actually treat you very differently no matter where you are.
Absolutely, especially when there's uncertainty as to what is expected of you to trade in that specific sector or area. And if it's harmonized nationally, it becomes much easier when you move from one area to the other. You don't have to learn the new lay of the land because you know that if you move from one area to the next, the same business principles or registration or policies will still apply. However, the biggest problem that we have is actually in the enforcement key. Sorry, I keep on going back to that point. But harmonization is important, and we need there's a need to actually have a digital identity of sorts of small businesses or even entrepreneurs, so that whenever you want to operate, government, even when you deal with government, your profile is the same, doesn't get to change by way of whether you're in Johannesburg or in Cape Town. So you should be able to trade. But look, different areas have got different profiles, and therefore maybe that is where you'd find that in some areas, it might be a need to tweak the rules to make sure that they're applicable to that. But there are general rules that should be applicable everywhere else. And unfortunately, the process seems to have stalled as far as I'm concerned. It would be a great thing to have a national policy of sort that will be applicable from provinces and municipalities. But that, for me, is the biggest question is when and if will that happen, and when will that really happen?
It gets me to another sort of interesting question, which is so often we have conversations about, let's do this intervention to grow the economy, let's do that, let's redefine this. Sometimes I just think if we just did what we're supposed to do properly, actually that would be the biggest intervention that we could make, whether it's keep the lights on, enforce the rule of law. If we just enforced the rule of law and didn't do anything else, that would surely probably...
That is at the heart of everything, the rule of law. And first, the rule of law. In fact, Stephen, finally we should be talking about this. Not so long ago, a couple of months ago, maybe sometime last year, we had government was up in arms saying, hey, we must regularly register spaza shops because kids have died from Tepifo and many other things. And then there was a brouhaha about this whole thing. And suddenly that has stopped. No sooner had it started, it started gradually and then it stopped so suddenly. Because now we don't even know how many of those were re-registered. Some don't know how many of those were denied registration. In fact, it seems to be business as usual. And you ask yourself, what is the point of registration if it cannot be enforced? If I may ask you, I do a lot of travel within townships. I mean, I've been in Alexandra most of last week. Have you ever seen inspectors going from store to store to inspect the shops to see whether they comply? There's no such thing happening. And you ask yourself, if that is not happening now, what will the national policy have? What will it do? What intervention will that have when the local authorities themselves today, either they don't have capacity or they don't have the gumption the courage to enforce the laws, or they're just disinterested at all, because it might very well work. It works for those who don't actually want to comply with the rules or the regulations.
Thanks very much indeed to Borgo Kaas from the Institute of Chartered Entrepreneurs. Well, I did expect a strong view from him. I don't know if you've got a view on this as well, but there's certainly so much to look at in terms of helping small business and the promises we've had again and again and again to cut red tape.
702. Stephen is on the Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
On the next Money Show, Gerrie Fourie, Capitec Bank's outgoing CEO, joins us as this week's shapeshifter. The Stellenbosch-based banker has expertise in twisted like pretzels over the definition of unemployment as it currently stands. Also, business unusual and the consumer ninja. Then, analysis of all of your top business news of the day.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024.
7 minutes now to 7 the time. Well, a series of conversations over the last few days about retirement, I think sparked by the decision by Standard Bank to raise its retirement age for top execs from 60 to 63. That, of course, would allow Sim Tshabalala to stay in office for a few more years, but I don't think that was necessarily the primary reason. Andrew Woodburn's managing director at Amrop Woodburn Mann. Andrew, good evening. Good to chat again. I mean, is there really a particular age at which people absolutely fundamentally cannot lead past this? Are we seeing a change in how we look at age in leadership?
Good evening, Stephen, and to the listeners. I mean, it's a fascinating question, and it's been a perennial question. How long should people work for? Should they retire at a certain age? And our big four accounting firms are very strict at 60 being the number, and of course that's been the traditional number. But my sense is people are living longer, they have vitality longer, they have mental clarity longer. And what we're seeing in the market actually is boards appointing individuals, in fact, who are well over 60. And so there's absolutely a trend now triggered by a number of different forces. And the Sim example at Standard Bank is, of course, unique. I don't think he has financial pressure that means he has to keep working, unlike the rest of us. But certainly with a struggling economy, it means a lot of leadership would like to extend their working lives, number one, from a financial perspective. But secondly, in my read, we're seeing boards in particular, because the listed companies certainly set the trend, appointing leadership with absolutely bulletproof track records of delivery. But of course, this is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the youth coming up the ladder and wanting the opportunity. But my view is our talent pool is shrinking. We know we've had brain drain 2.0 since the Zuma years, in which case there's less to choose from. Succession is harder to get right. And what's starting to happen is the economy, whether it's actually enlisted or entrepreneurial businesses, are looking to those individuals who are going to deliver. And that covers the full pool, whether it's white males over 60 or whether it's the younger millennials and black individuals coming up. But it's all about quality, Stephen.
So if you keep older people in harness for a little longer, if you keep them in leadership positions for a little longer, does that not frustrate the younger people below them? In that you would like to think that you know the person above you is going to be out at 60 or 65. If you're 50, you can sort of plan the rest of your career, and that's quite important to know. I mean, arguably, that's what happened with Kenny Fichler. I mean, I don't know for sure that happened. Maybe it didn't. But I mean, isn't that one of the issues? If you let people stick around for too long, actually, you might create problems for yourself lower down. I mean, people will build empires. I would.
You're dead right. And it certainly was a trend pre-COVID. If you looked from the year 2000, where technology certainly became a critical cornerstone of almost any business, there was an absolute trend to appoint younger leadership. They were more in touch, they were more modern, they were more sophisticated. You had the millennials, you had all the different gens coming through, and the younger leadership certainly was felt at times to be more progressive, more technologically enabled. But in our marketplace, where we've been in a peri or semi or full recessionary environment, and we've lost talent, and post-COVID, we've seen that individuals who've got the track record and the depth and the maturity and the ability to both deliver as well as deal with analysts, the banks, the shareholders, I've seen a trend back to individuals who can deliver. Now, for those youngsters, actually what's happened is they got used to being promoted year on year on year, whether it was from a transformation perspective, whether it was from that bring the youth forward faster. And what we've now seen, unfortunately, I believe, is some individuals who were promoted according to the Peter Principle beyond where their capabilities are now. I just believe this is the needle coming back to the middle. This is the needle coming back to who has the skills, the experience, the leadership depth to be able to do the job, whether that is a turnaround job, whether that's a growth job, whether that's an innovation job. And, we can throw our stones, Stephen, at Sean Summers in Pick and Pay, at Chart in Tiger Brands, and I can keep going here, right? I just think we are right-sizing the expectations. And it was that pre-COVID world where the youth thought, oh, I'll just be the CEO at 36. Or I'll go even further, Stephen. I'll be an independent non-executive director at 38. I think the environment is proving that it's only the unique, brilliant individuals who can be there, and they're always going to be a minority. For the rest, true leadership, really, it's 50 plus.
How important is age diversity in a leadership group? I mean, the world has changed fundamentally. You may well be running an organization or institution that caters for very diverse clients in terms of age, among many other things. How important is it to have a little bit of a mixture of young and older in your sort of top leadership?
So I think the word diversity should be taken as a 360 concept. It's not just race. It's not just gender. I mean, those are the obvious two that we've been working on, certainly in our country, and globally, gender has been the issue. But what has begun to happen, in fact, because of technology, because of cloud, because of ecosystem thinking, often the executives with talent, experience, and knowledge in those areas have been younger executives. So by the very nature of the modern business, we are absolutely beginning to see diversity cut both race, gender, age, and in fact, I believe styles of thinking, global exposure, and you and I can keep going, culture, and so on. And that, in the true sense of the word of diversity, leads to high quality thinking, better ideas, and at the end of the day, great delivery.
Andrew Woodburn, thanks so much. Managing Director at Amrop Woodburn Mann. Well, I don't know if you've decided when you want to stop working, if that conversation has anything to do with it. I have been interested, and I do watch with some interest the kind of discussions that people of different ages and who see themselves of different generations have, how ambitious you are, and then the preconceptions that we all have about each other. Sometimes quite hilarious to sort of hear it from the other side. And it does just tell you that we're all absolutely guilty of it. You're with The Money Show. Good evening. It's 7 o'clock.
The Money Show.
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
And DSTV channel 856.
Well, if you look at the awful flooding we've had in the Eastern Cape, and it's taken so many people from us, and then the intense heat waves that Europe is experiencing at the moment, it seems to me that it makes more and more sense for businesses, no matter what size you are, to pay quite a lot of attention to climate change. Sean Charlie is the area manager at Business Partners. Sean, good evening. How should smaller firms, SMEs, be approaching this issue? Where should they be starting with their strategies?
Good evening, Stephen and your listeners. Thanks for having us. The best way how SMEs can really approach, looking at the climate change challenges for small businesses is best directive would be to look at a feasibility study on their businesses, on the environment. Normally with feasibilities, it should show you, the scope in terms of how you can reduce the risk for your business to be exposed to droughts and to flooding. And in that strategy, you will also find sort of directives in how your business can be competitive, and also how you can enhance your brand quality or your loyalty for your customer.
We see a lot of big corporates doing various things, and they often talk quite a lot about what they're doing, Sean. Could it be easier actually for smaller firms to be changing their approach because of this?
Definitely. Smaller businesses are actually far more positioned. The agility of small businesses, their decisions, quick turnaround times in terms of, implementing new processes. They are actually more positioned for them to take advantages of these incentives and to allow their businesses to become greener sooner than corporates, where corporates find it a little bit difficult through the decision-making processes, where a small business has the ability where the decisions can be made quicker. They can identify the risk and immediately put systems in place how they can reduce that risk that they are exposed to.
It's one of the big advantages of smaller firms. It should be anyway, the ability to make decisions more quickly, implement them, follow them up, things like that. And this should be an area where you really see that.
Definitely. We see that, especially with entrepreneurs that are looking to scale their businesses, they always identify new opportunities in the market. And with all the awareness around the green economy, climate changes, your stakeholders have even becoming more aware to the need for specific needs in terms of how to address these risks to the environment. So some customers to SMEs might find it that they need SMEs that can provide services that doesn't affect the environment, and how they also have systems in place, how they use their electricity, maybe water usage. So these are actually the new sort of a new way of doing business, where businesses, especially in the SME and sector, they find it exciting, where they can really have a business that stands out from the rest and how they can improve their competitiveness in the market.
What kind of green strategies work for smaller firms? And I think there's a perception that, going green is very expensive for a smaller company. I mean, it can sometimes sound like that.
That's where the challenges normally comes in terms of for small businesses to make the adoption. But for companies, especially in the SME sector, it's all about how you position yourself as a company, as a brand to the market. And these strategies doesn't necessarily include huge expenses or costs that you need to bring in. Some of it can be simplistic approaches that you can follow. Firstly, you can encourage your team, your staff, how you can encourage them to be more conscious towards how to save electricity in the business, how the water systems are being utilized, maybe even looking at how your valves in your business, how are they being useful for the business. Then you can also, your supply chain, you can also look at in terms of your suppliers that you have. Maybe instead of having suppliers that are too far, maybe you can look at suppliers that are close by in terms of reducing the carbon print. But the key thing will be to also create an ecosystem where like-minded entrepreneurs are sort of focusing on how to improve the environment, where you're looking at biodegradable products, you're looking at maybe some packaging, products that have low impact on the environment. Those are some of the simplistic approaches that SME can follow. And then you need to look at also with your team, encourage your staff to be more conscious towards the environment. These are just some of the strategies that SMEs can really apply without incurring huge amount of costs.
I mean, part of it is actually just being, it's a funny phrase, but mindful. If everybody in the company is aware that you're trying to do this and looking for opportunities to do it, without even trying very hard, you might find you're making quite a big difference.
Yes, most definitely. You will find that some companies just went in how they're processing, maybe just from their accounts department, going paperless, bringing in new approaches in terms of how they have to print less paper. That also has a huge impact on the environment. Although it doesn't seem like it's a big improvement, but little by little, it has an impact on the environment as a whole. And these are some of the small things that's really there that can just, be repositioned or reconfigured in the business. And this is also where a feasibility can really be important for an entrepreneur, where he can identify the list of things that it can immediately act upon and make a decision how to improve the efficiency of the business.
Are there people who will kind of help you do it? I mean, someone must be running a good small business and making small businesses go green. but are there people who'll help you find ways to do it?
Yes, no, there's quite a few consultants out there. It's also about how the entrepreneur identify what the consultant is. Does the consultant really know the business? Does he understand the industry, the sector, or what's the challenges that comes for a business of that nature? So it's really about how the entrepreneur can network and identify the right type of individual or maybe firm that can assist them with the feasibility or sustainability assessment. But there are quite a few guys out there. It's just finding the right person and with the right accreditation and also having the right qualifications to ensure that the advice that the entrepreneur receives is credible and does really have an impact in the business.
And then translating all of this to customers, presumably, and I think you see this more and more, people are more aware, they're more conscious, they're more, there's that word mindful, but generally they're starting to take this kind of thing a lot more seriously and starting to demand it of others and of people who they buy goods and services from.
Definitely. We find it that the response from the market is that, if your business is green, brings some form of a class. It brings some form of a your seriousness towards your customer base. So you'll find it. If your business is green, I mean, to have a product that's locally produced, services that are locally sourced, you have minimal waste. It further enhances your brand as a business, and it makes you more attractive to the market to be able to bring your services or your goods to a specific sector. So there has been, especially amongst the younger generation, there has been huge consciousness around how SMEs really conduct themselves, having also that consciousness in terms of how they perceive the environment and really show that they care about the environment that they are trading in. So we have seen a lot of sort of customer behavior or market behavior changes in terms of how the market is slowly been gravitating towards a greener environment that SMEs are trading in.
Sean Charlie, thanks very much indeed, the area manager at Business Partners. Very interesting just to hear how all of that actually is going to pan out and how people are expecting that process of smaller firms to essentially move on from here.
The Money Show.
The Africa Business Report.
Dr. Rotendo Ndwengis, founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory and author of Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Rotendo, good to see you. How's it?
Very well, Stephen.
So, I don't know, how do you say this? PAPS, P-A-P-S-S. This is the payment initiative. It's expanding to a lot more countries.
It is, and this is spearheaded by the African Bank, Stephen, and the Pan-African Payment Settlement System. So I've educated you there something, Stephen, when you always educate me. And the reason why there's a bit of a hype now, and this was announced at the recent on the news headlines, is that 15 financial institutions and 14 national switches are now connected. So it's a milestone achievement. Why is this important? Because it's a key component of the AfCFTA with regards to the free movement of goods and people. Why is that such a big thing? Because at the end of the day, if people and goods are moving across the country freely, across the continent freely, then there has to be a free movement of money. And that's why it plays a key role. Just to give you some stats, Stephen, as of 2023, $2 billion went through that system. The cumulative figure since it opened up in 2022 was $68 billion. And the vision of PAPS in terms of the coming years is that they want to expand, or in this year, 2025, they want to expand to 30 countries on the continent. And there's a key focus in terms of leveraging of AI. And one of the key areas they're focusing in is in the agri-sector, because agriculture plays a key role on the continent. But another key component as well is that with anti-money laundering, Africa has always been sort of had a big loophole there, and they're using AI through this application in order of managing that. So, but a key milestone in terms of AfCFTA and leveraging of a payment system that can integrate the continent, Stephen.
I mean, it's fascinating to watch payment systems change and evolve, and more we've had our issues with the grey list and the Financial Action Task Force and all the rest. But you've got to manage them very, very carefully. People get quite a little more... It sounds simple, we should all use the same payment system. Actually, it's incredibly complicated.
No, it is. And just to give you how complicated it is, perhaps at the moment, I think they're probably linking about, and these are individual accounts, banking accounts, 500 million bank accounts within its system. So obviously it's from small startups to big corporates, and it goes on and on. But the idea is that you've got a lot of money integrated to a lot of countries, interacting with a lot of multifaceted scenarios. So at the end of the day, if there's seamless interaction and engagement from a financial perspective, that's all great. But at the end of the day, it has to stimulate the economy, it has to stimulate trade and the free movement of people and goods. So it's something to continue watching, but a key milestone, and the African Bank has to be applauded. And I think the president, or Professor Benedict, who stepped down from the leadership, and with the new leader coming on board, I think as a legacy, he's left something quite significant as one of his achievements.
Ethiopian Investment Holdings, they've signed a deal with the US private equity fund. They're going to build a 5-star hotel in Addis.
a 5-star hotel in Addis Ababa. So why is this important? I mean, Ethiopia has been making a lot of key non-economic initiatives just in terms of developing the economy. They've partnered up with the US. They recently announced this at the big US Africa conference that happened in Angola. I think the cost of the investment is estimated to be about $250 million US. That's quite significant. Why is that important? They've actually started trading on FCFTA today, so 1 July. And that's another big milestone. You remember last year, Stephen, we talked about how they'd liberalized the economy by floating the currency. They'd often also listed, I think earlier this year, their first stock exchange. They've reopened their stock exchange.
Can't have a stock exchange without a 5-star hotel, Lucindo. I mean, we all know this.
So if you travel to Ethiopia, you need to stay somewhere good and fun. But another thing also, the airport that they've expanded, remember, that's also looking at processing 100 million passengers. That's more than the population of South Africa. So all of these things have attracted investors, and they want to create, obviously, good landing ground for investors and investees coming onto the country. So $250 million US have gone into a hotel. The Ethiopian Investment Holdings, the EIH, is the one driving the initiative, and it's quite a significant thing. So quite excited about that and looking, and I think Ethiopia's got its challenges, but they're definitely making key initiatives from an economic reform perspective that will stimulate the economy and take it to the next level.
And then malaria, obviously a major issue for us, and there's quite a lot more technology around this now.
So just 600,000 people every year die in Africa because of malaria. So it's still taking its toll. And I think the impact on GDP, Stephen, is estimated to be $16 billion US in total in Africa. So, you'd have thought by now, in terms of technology, in terms of investment in the medical space, that would have overcome the challenges of malaria, but was still far behind. There's a Japanese company called Sora Technology, and these are private investors, and they've used AI technology using drones that specifically go and detect mosquito breeding and apply larvicides, which are the insecticides to kill mosquitoes. And I think they've invested in Nigeria. They're looking going into Ghana and the rest of Africa. They've recently received another, and these are the Japanese investors. They've injected another $4.8 million US in this initiative. The outcome of this obviously results in a 70% reduction in insecticides, a 40% savings in prevention costs, and a 50% decrease in labor costs. At the end of the day, for Africa to be a healthy economy, Stephen, or to be productive, for us to go to the next level where there's industrialization, you need a healthy workforce. And malaria is one of the, unfortunately, those things that hold us back, amongst other challenges. So this is a positive investment. I think when I was looking at this article and reading it, Stephen, I think my frustration was where were the African investors? It's an African problem, but I think we should have more of our African investors leading the charge. And in this case, these are private investors from Japan, who are actually making this investment, and they're seeing the return on investment. And the big question is, where are the African investors with regards to providing these homegrown solutions? So at the end of the day, we benefit as a continent, but still there's that gap or that query in terms of why are African investors not investing in homegrown solutions.
It's very, very interesting. In Gambia, there's a farmed fish, and Europe likes farmed fish big time. What impact is that happening on people in the Gambia?
So the Gambia, it's a very small country, Stephen. You know, when you look at the GDP,
they had that very interesting leader for a long time.
He didn't have to walk around a lot in terms of his country. I mean, Gambia is almost like, I think it's either Lesotho or Swaziland. It's a strip within Senegal.
You know the colonial history of it. It was
really?
So the idea was that this is the sort of colonial legend, right? So I mean, don't take it seriously.
No, history is history. Stephen.
Yeah. So the story was that a British warship went up a river and then fired shells in 4 different directions, and where they landed were the borders of Gambia.
It's very possible.
Yeah, that's the story.
It's very possible. The GDP, Stephen, is 2.3 billion. The population is 2.3 million. So it's almost a GDP per capita of $1,000 per person, which is actually fascinating. But anyway, coming back to reality, one of the big challenges that they have is that they've got a lot of European industrialized fishing businesses taking out fish from their shores, namely I'm trying to remember the bonga fish and the sardines. And the impact it's making is obviously, as a small economy, it relies a lot of fish as a subsidy for its people and its businesses. The estimated loss that they're making, not just Gambia, but if you bring all the surrounding countries of Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, as well as Sierra Leone, they're losing about $2.3 billion US. So it's quite significant for an economy like this in terms of the challenge that are there. So I think the big thing is that now they're fighting with the EU, trying to take back the rights with regards to those that they'd given to the EU. And obviously that in itself is a complicated mess, especially when you're not a big economic powerhouse and you want to fight the big guys again. And I think it just highlights again is that the challenge that is always there for Africa was seen with the DRC, with the US. When you structure these deals where you want to benefit economically, but it's at the expense of the local people, there's always a balancing act. And I think that's where Gambia finds itself in terms of trying to sustain its economy and its people, and something to continue watching.
I mean, Saudi Arabia is lending $38 million to Tunisia.
$38 million US. And, when you look at the history of Saudi and Tunisia, it goes back apparently about 75 years. And over that 75 years, Stephen, they've given Tunisia has received from Saudi through the Saudi Development Fund about $1.2 billion US in sessional loans and grants to the point of $105 million US. And this is Saudi investing in Tunisia. And in this specific investment, the 38 million is targeted specifically towards the Oasis project, which is forecast in terms of 1,000 hectares of agri-land that has been refurbished and been developed. There's also to equip about 22 wells in terms of digging and producing water, and deliver about 285 housing units. So it's quite a positive story. I think the sad thing is that at the end of the day, Saudi is still battling in terms of debt. Their public debt is about $50 billion US. And the last thing also, Stephen, is that they're the fourth highest in the Arab world in terms of debt. I think their debt savings at about $3.8 billion US, and they're fourth after Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. So great investment is coming in, but as an economy, there's still a lot of reforms and things that they have to do to change direction and move in the right direction.
Dr. Rutendo Ndwingi, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. The founding director of Tribe Africa Advisory, also author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Bringing the time now on The Money Show to 7:30.
The Money.
Travel isn't just about destinations. It's about the people you meet, the cultures you immerse yourself in, the stories you carry home. I'm Relebogile Mabocha, and on my travel feature, I take you on a journey beyond the guidebook. Each week, I connect with fellow travelers, insiders, and storytellers to bring you the heart of every place. Whether it's a hidden gem right here in South Africa or a dream destination abroad. Join me as we travel through conversations, memories, and inspiration. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
And Warren, of course, is a certified financial planner at Galileo Capital. Warren, good evening. We're talking unit trusts tonight. When was it? Back in 19-something that they were first created?
1965, Stephen. They're even older than me, and I was a bit surprised actually when I was prepping for the show to see that they're 60 years old this year, and it's remarkable. They've for a long time felt like the new kids on the block, but now they're grandparents.
Okay, so I mean, they've been around for a while. You are going to have to start, as always, with me with a definition. How would you define at the very beginning a unit trust?
So the thing about a unit trust is it's a group of us that almost definitely don't know each other, and what happens is we pool our money together. So we club together and we put our money in one very big, large pool, and with that pool, it gets administered by independent custodian. So it's not just, everyone puts it in Warren's bank account and we hope that he's going to do the bookkeeping. It goes into an independent custodian who says, okay, I'm going to keep record of each of you and how much each of you have put in. And then once that money is put together, it's then invested on behalf of all of the individual investors by a fund manager. And in the early days, that would be a fund manager who would say, I'm just going to buy shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, as an example. Over time, what happened is that they started diversifying away from just shares on the stock exchange. They started buying bonds. They started buying cash. Creating money market unit trust. So over this last 60 years, they've actually created many hundreds of different kinds of unit trusts, so that you can do everything from buy a generic money market account right up to a global fund that invests in shares. And then there is the original kind of one answer to all questions, which is the balanced unit trust. And most of us, if we invest in a retirement annuity, the likelihood is we own at least one, if not a few of those balanced unit trusts. The important thing always about a unit trust is no one owns the assets of a unit trust except the actual investors. So if I were to launch, the Money Show unit trust tomorrow, and let's say it didn't work out in a year's time, it wouldn't matter that the Money Show went bankrupt. That's never going to happen, Stephen. But let's just say it did. It wouldn't matter, because the investors would still be safe. They would still have all the money. They would be the owners of the fund, and then they would get paid out the money in that fund. So the benefit of a unit trust is it's very well regulated, independently administered by a custodian, and then a fund manager who manages the money according to a particular mandate or a benchmark or an agreed kind of objective for the fund. So I think that's maybe the reason that they've been around for so long, is we've never seen in South Africa's history a situation where a crook has managed to take over a unit trust and steal all the money out of a fund. We've seen, I think it's going way back to the Fidentia days, where someone tried to do that, but it wasn't possible. And so I think that's probably a key for investors. It's transparent and something that we know is at least safe from fraud, if not bad decisions, which will always be a risk with investing.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. There's a sort of pizza analogy to this, isn't there?
Yeah, so if you want to kind of get to the point of having a bit more variety in your life, and you can't afford to buy a massive pizza, what you can do is ask your friends to kind of club in together, and then collectively you buy one very big pizza with a whole lot of different ingredients on it, and then you can take a slice. And if you say, look, I'm happy to pay for half of the pizza, then you get half of the number of slices. Whereas perhaps if it's the end of the month money and you haven't been that good with your budgeting, maybe you're going to take a tiny slice. But the benefit there is that you get an allocation of a whole lot of different ingredients, and you get to taste at least a very nice slice of pizza, but it doesn't mean that you're prohibited from eating it because you have no money to buy the big one. You can club in with your friends and at least get a share. And to me, I like that as an analogy for us in the when we're looking at unit trusts, is we can't afford, for example, to buy every single share on the JSE, plus every single share globally, plus a collection of bonds and property companies and cash, and put that together in a portfolio for ourselves. We just wouldn't have enough money. But if there are a bunch of us putting all of that money together, then we can do that, and we get a lot more optionality around our investments, a lot more spread, and it's something that a small investor can participate in a very nice big portfolio alongside a bigger investor, and maybe tens of thousands of investors between the small and the large, and a whole variety in between. So it gives us a lot of variety and a lot of choice, and doing it on our own terms, because the nice thing about a unit trust is you buy in when you want to, and you exit when you want to. You're not stuck in there for a period of time in a contract or some kind of a terrible marriage where you're locked in for life. You can always sell out of a unit trust. They trade every single day of the week.
And then the key players is quite a small number, which must be attractive too.
I think so. I think, understanding that it gets a bit technical, which we don't need to get into, but essentially you've got a fund manager, and typically their name will be on the box. So it will be XYZ fund managers, and it will be their equity fund or their balanced fund or their cautious fund. And what they have is the right to manage that money according to what they've promised you. So they're going to set the objectives of the fund, and those objectives are strictly controlled by regulators, who will say, if you're going to invest in a fund that's called a general equity fund, it means you have to buy shares only. You may not buy shares, bonds, property, and maybe half of the fund in cash. That's not called a general equity fund. So the fund manager gets an agreed mandate, and that fund manager then does their very best to buy the shares that they believe in. And particularly ones that they think will give you long-term growth, faster than the index. What is important there is that it's not the fund manager's asset. So if that fund is worth 10 billion rand, the only people that own the 10 billion rand are the investors. So that would be all of us as individuals that have bought into that fund. And then separate from the fund manager and separate from the investors will then be an administration company that will take responsibility for keeping all the records, or basically the bookkeeping of the fund, and making sure that they know who owns what and who's entitled to what, and also then a custodian who looks after the assets to make sure that if the fund manager goes bankrupt, that the assets are still preserved, and that between the custodian and the administration company, they know who needs to get paid back. So there's that separation of responsibilities and very clear separation of who owns the assets and who has the right to manage those assets and charge a fee. And the interesting thing about unit trusts is that they really became popular a long time ago because they were so very transparent with the way that they charged and what they were buying on behalf of investors. And that wasn't the case when we go back to the 60s. Money was generally controlled by insurance companies. They would put the money in big, very, very big pools, and you would just know that you're an investor in a pool of money, but you'd have no idea really what was inside that pool. You would have no idea what was actually being charged and what was being bought and sold on a monthly or quarterly basis. You would just get these vague reports every 6 months or every year, and you would hope that they would be right. So that's the other point about these, is that the administration company provides that transparency.
It does seem to be a real leap above. You can see why they're so popular. All right, different types of unit trusts that are available. Let's start with equity funds.
So just, unfortunately, my industry is full of jargon. So equity basically means shares, and you get a range of unit trusts that exclusively invest in shares. So the kind of original one would be general equity, and what that means is that it can buy shares across any of the sectors on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So whether it's mining shares, industrial, technology, pharmaceuticals, etc. And so it's got a broad mandate, and typically you'll find those will have quite a bias to larger companies on the JSE, just because they are the ones that are most investable. And nowadays you also get a global equity fund. So it just means that you can access a fund that buys shares on stock exchanges around the world. Then it does get a bit more specific. So you can get a fund, for example, that only invests in financial services companies, or only invests in mining houses or industrial businesses, etc. And globally, there are many more industrial sectors around the world. So you can, for example, buy a company that only invests in tech shares, or only invests in biotech or pharmaceuticals, etc. So a bit more variety overseas. Then you get bond funds, and typically those are funds that own a selection of government bonds and corporate bonds, and then maybe a variety of things called inflation-linked bonds and short-term money market instruments. So the idea there is that you're getting exposure to a broad bond market without being locked into only one bond. Then I think one that's probably familiar to a lot of us would be a money market unit trust, which is really a place where you store cash to earn the greatest or the highest rate of interest that you can for a short period of time. And hopefully it's a parking vehicle for you to do something with that money. It's certainly not a place you should be storing your investment money for long periods of time. Then the Swiss Army knife of unit trusts is the balanced fund. So that's a fund that will give you an allocation to cash, bonds, property, shares. Typically, if it's a balanced fund, it's got a bigger exposure to shares, and 45% of balanced funds can be invested internationally. So it gives you a huge amount of exposure to all different kinds of assets in South Africa and all around the world. So it's probably the one, as I mentioned, that we would own in our retirement funds, most of us. Then lastly, you get more and more of these very narrow speciality funds where you can buy a fund that only invests in commercial property or only invests in industrial buildings or gold, for example. They're, very, very popular a few years ago was just a, gold fund. And globally, especially, there are funds that will invest in according to values or religion. So you get Sharia funds, you get, ethical funds that, avoid tobacco and alcohol and those kinds of things, the sin stocks. So you do get very, very specialized unit trusts as well.
It's so interesting just to see how many different types there are. I mean, it really does suggest that there are very big differences in all of this. So obviously, you've got different ways in which you could do it, but you've got unit trusts, you've got exchange-traded funds, ETFs, and you've got direct shares. How do you assess which is the best one, especially if unit trusts have been around for so long and by and large seem to have done pretty well?
They have, and I think they are very, very large in investors' lives all around the world, and definitely in South Africa. And I think that the question then is, when something's old and established, is it not ripe for disruption? And are there not alternatives that might be, bigger, better, faster? And in the investment world, bigger, better, faster means can you access those those underlying investments inside a unit trust more cheaply, more efficiently, maybe even more transparently, and can you do that, without being constrained to only buying and selling once a day? And that's really what exchange-traded funds are. Is they'll give you very similar optionality to a unit trust. So you can find an exchange-traded fund that only buys South African shares or only buys global shares or only owns gold, etc. The difference now is that you can buy that on a stockbroking account or an investment platform. And very often you can do that on your phone, and you can trade those exchange-traded funds 5 or 15 times per day if you really wanted to. I wouldn't recommend it. It'll cost you a fortune in transaction costs, but they're a lot more tradable and give you potentially a cost saving. I think one of the things that happened with unit trusts is because they were so big and so dominant, they weren't that efficient on fees. So they were a bit sluggish and on reducing costs for investors, and were very profitable for the asset managers. And so one of the things that happened with the advent of the exchange-traded fund market was it forced the unit trust managers to wake up to the reality that they were overcharging and they needed to become a lot more efficient. So in the early days of exchange traded funds, you could find a fund that would cost you 0.5%, and a unit trust doing the same job might have cost you 1.5%. So there was a real threat to unit trusts, and exchange traded funds grew very quickly as a result. I think that the unit trust market has woken up to that, though, and nowadays you find that they are quite competitive on price. So the cost differential is not so big anymore, but the tradability is the advantage that exchange traded funds have. They trade in exactly the same way on the stock exchange as if you were buying a share. So I think that is an advantage, and potentially on the more modern platforms, they're a bit cheaper to buy an exchange traded fund for small amounts. For example, you could buy an exchange traded fund with 50 Rand or 100 Rand on some platforms, whereas most unit trusts, they'll want a minimum of at least 500 Rand as a debit order and maybe 1,000 or even 10,000 Rand as a lump sum. So I do think that they've had a bit of competition. They have lost some market share, but I think that they're adapting, as the industry would, Stephen.
Yes, no, of course. And then with direct shares, you just buy what you want. I mean, that's simple, and you know exactly where you are.
Yeah, and if you are someone who has very high conviction that you believe what the next big thing is going to be, and it's a company that's listed, whether it's in South Africa or overseas, and if you believe that you've got an idea of what will be the next Apple, what will be the next Meta, and you wouldn't want to necessarily buy that as part of a pool of money, whether it's in an exchange traded fund or a unit trust. So the option there with the direct shares, you can allocate more money to a single investment, and if your research or whatever it is, that's caused you to kind of come up with a view, if that works out, you could make a lot of money. And history is full of those kinds of examples of people that a very long time ago bought Naspers when it was 100 rand a share, and it got to 3,000 or 4,000 rand a share, and those people have made a lot of money. And the same with Apple, etc. So there is the advantage of being very specific with direct shares. The tradability is the same as an exchange traded fund, and the transparency is there. I would say, and I have to, I'm just, the risk manager inside me says, you've got to tell people that, your share could go from 100 rand to zero. We've seen companies blow up. And so that's the one big downside of a direct share is you've got all your eggs in that one basket. And, if it does well, that's great. If it goes to zero, you have nothing. And that has happened quite a lot in our country and all around the world.
A question for you coming in from Johan. Warren, hi, I need to draw a large amount of money from my investments for a deposit on a house. Is there a good way to do this? We'll have an answer for you, Johan, in just a moment.
The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
And we had a question for you, Warren, from Johan saying, I need to draw a large amount of money from my investments for a deposit on a house. Is there a good way to do this? Look, I know, Warren, you're going to say you never really want to withdraw money from your investments, but to do it for a house, probably the best possible reason.
I guess you're right, Stephen. I would prefer that you keep your money invested and live off a bit of the income to pay rent on a house. But if you are going to buy a house and it is a chunky amount of money that you've got to take out of your investments, I think two things that would come to mind. One will be the tax implications of selling money, selling an investment, because if it's grown well, there is a big chance that you're going to pay capital gains tax. So depending on how much time you've got to make that decision to sell the investment, you might want to do it over 1 year or preferably 2 tax years, because we're allowed to make 40,000 rands worth of profit on an investment before we pay tax. So if you can do it, let's say in January 1 tax year, and then you do half of what's required then, and you do the other half in March of the following tax year, that means you get 80,000 rands worth of profit before you pay tax, and that could save you a bit of capital gains tax. The other thing is, markets are so incredibly volatile now. They're moving in such big roller coasters that I'm not sure that I would want to sell all of my investments at one moment in time, and so I would really think about selling a portion. If you've got a bit of time on your side, let's say you've got 6 months before you need the money, then what you could do is sell a third now, wait 2 months, sell another third, and then wait 2 months and sell the last third. And the hope there is that if markets go up between now and then you're participating in some of that growth and you're locking in kind of higher prices over time. However, if markets fall apart between now and then the hope is that you've at least locked in 1/3 or 2/3 of the money at higher prices, and the last third might be a little bit exposed to a loss. But phasing money out of an investment is, I think, as sensible as phasing money into investments, especially when you're dealing in large lump sums. So just be aware of transaction costs. That's maybe my last comment. And then, if you can be tax efficient, do that. But be careful of trying to make very big calls and timing your decisions. You can't get it right when we've got people like Trump in this world.
Yeah, no, that really is the problem now. There was this astonishing comment from the research arm, the investment research arm of BlackRock today, saying that they're focusing on 6 to 12 month horizons at the moment because the anchors of the global economy have sort of disappeared. I thought that was a direct comment about the Trump administration from a real mover in the capitalist world. That's kind of the problem that we're facing.
We are, and when you see the chairman of the Reserve Bank of America saying, we would have cut interest rates if it wasn't for tariffs and the noise around tariffs. The tariffs haven't really taken effect properly, but what's happened is the threat is hanging over the world, and so just the threat of something which could be implemented or might not be implemented at all is really disrupting things, and then there is this move from the west to the east in terms of economic power. I think always the one advantage we've got as private investors is we don't have to move with other people's time horizons, so we can make investment decisions that are good for us over a 5 or 10 year period. And what I can tell you is whatever happens in the next 6 or 12 months, it's very unlikely to persist over 5 to 10 years. So if you stretch out your time horizon, you can kind of make yourself a little bit immune to all the noise and all the volatility. Markets tend to go up and do very well over longer periods of time. So that would be my secret in this whole thing.
Very quickly then, between ETFs and unit trusts and shares, ETFs, unit trusts, I mean, shares you're not a big fan of because you can lose all your money quite easily.
Yep, I think that the unit trusts still are going to be the vehicle for most of us. You know, they do very well for debit order investing, especially, and you know, when you want lots of diversification. But you know, if you are trading small amounts of money, it might be better to do that with exchange traded funds. But don't be scared of unit trusts because they're just because they're old, they're actually still pretty good.
Thanks very much indeed. Warren Ingram, of course, certified financial planner at Galileo Capital and with Personal Finance on The Money Show this evening.